to a mere 5 days. In line, that would be with the rules now in America. But first, it's time for the news headlines with Paul. Thanks, Colin. Good morning. Our top story at 11. The Prime Minister says 90% of people in intensive care have not received their COVID-19 booster. Speaking at a vaccination centre, Boris Johnson said 2.4 million eligible double jab people were yet to receive their booster. He's urging them to get the jab so they could enjoy the new year cautiously and sensibly. Meanwhile, the Scottish Parliament will be recalled this afternoon for a COVID update as case numbers there reach record highs. The virtual session was announced last week after new restrictions came in, including closing nightclubs and 1 metre social distancing. Scots are also being urged not to travel to England for New Year's Eve, where clubs are still open. The Lib Dem MP, Christine Jardine, believes the UK-wide governments should have joined forces from the start of the pandemic.
Should have had from the beginning in this, I believe, is that we should have had a much more concerted, more cooperative, four nations approach. The United Kingdom government should have been, if you like, setting the benchmarks, and we should have had local responses to what was happening. Instead of which we have this confusion about the UK government saying one thing and then the Scottish government saying another.
Meanwhile, some pharmacies are reporting a huge problem with shortages of lateral flow tests, saying there were requests every 5 minutes over Christmas. The Association of Independent Multiple Pharmacies is warning of patchy supplies following a change in self-isolation rules from 10 to 7 days if someone tests negative. The UK Health Security Agency say the delivery capacity for testing kits has doubled to 900,000 a day since mid-December due to the unprecedented demand. Policing insulate Britain's road-blocking protests costs taxpayers at least £4.3 million. The group blocked motorways for 3 months, calling on the government to cut carbon emissions by insulating homes. The Metropolitan Police spent the bulk of the money, with over 6,600 officers and staff dealing with the campaigners. The Transport Secretary Grant Shapps said he was appalled by the bill. Social care system is not fit for purpose and is handing some children over to criminal gangs, according to a new report. The Commission on Young Lives says many teenagers are moved away from where they live and sometimes end up in areas with high levels of crime. Criminal gangs have also been tipped off when vulnerable teens are moved into unregulated accommodation. The Department for Education says it is urgently reforming the system to address growing pressures. Former Children's Commissioner for England and chair of the report, Anne Longfield, told GB News more needs to be done.
We've got is, in all kind of essence, an epidemic of teenagers that are coming to harm. They're being exploited, they're being targeted by gangs and those that wish to involve them in violence. I'd like a new teenagers' social care system, if you like. I'd like it to really concentrate on understanding and recognising when teenagers were at harm early and working with those families to wrap support around those families. We need a kind of ring of protection for those kids.
An economic think tank is warning that millions of families face a cost of living catastrophe in 2022. The Resolution Foundation says that from next April, families will be £1,200 a year worse off due to soaring energy bills and a rise in national insurance contributions. At the same time, rising inflation means that real pay levels will stay the same. A Merseyside police officer has been sacked for gross misconduct after taking selfies at a murder scene while on duty. PC Ryan Connolly took photos of himself while guarding the cordon in 2018. He also had homophobic, racist and offensive images on his phone. Deputy Chief Constable Ian Critchley said Connolly's actions were appalling and beyond comprehension. And the Royal Mint has unveiled 2 new coins to celebrate the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. The 50p coin is the first of its kind to recognise a royal event, whilst the £5 coin follows the tradition of marking previous Jubilees on crown pieces. They're both the first collector's items to be released in memory of the Queen's 70-year reign. You're up to date with the latest headlines. We'll have more for you in an hour.
Well, then, Colin Brazier with you through until 2 p.m. today. We're going to give you about 15 minutes or so news this hour, and it's focusing very much on COVID. And this question in particular, is Britain on the verge effectively of lockdown by stealth right now? Not because Omicron is hospitalising thousands, but because our system of quarantine is beginning to mean that NHS workers, to take but one group, are self-isolating and off work. Might we learn something about how other countries are dealing with the new variant in South Africa, where it was first observed, of course, self-isolation? It's been scrapped, at least for those who don't show symptoms. We were just saying in the news bulletin there. In America, there's also a relaxation. Anyone with COVID who is asymptomatic need now only self-isolate for 5 days. They must carry on wearing a mask, as you'd expect. The US Centre for Disease Control and Prevention said this decision was scientifically sensible and will, they say, keep society functioning. Meanwhile, England has already reduced its own self-isolation period from 10 days to 7 in an attempt to counter the COVID-induced staff shortages across the country, most notably within our National Health Service. Let's turn to Professor Klaus Okenhaug, who's a Professor of Immunology at the Department of Pathology at the University of Cambridge. Professor, thanks so much for your time. Before we get into your sense of how our knowledge and understanding of Omicron is evolving, I just wonder on this specific question of self-isolation. There do seem now to be different approaches to the period that's required across the world. Discussions may be taking place right now in Edinburgh about whether Scotland ought to move from 10 to 7 days, mimicking what's happening in England. Do you take a view on this?
You know, I thought reducing it from 10 to 7 days with a proviso that you have 2 negative tests before you return to work was a sensible measure, and I think that's defensible. Whether it's sensible to immediately go down to 5, I'm not so sure. I think maybe we should stick to 7 and see how that works out. At some point, you know, if you have a very, very short isolation period, you have to wonder whether it's better to go back. At some point, we're not going to have to isolate for this, that you have the more common sense kind of thing that you don't go to work when you are symptomatic. But for the moment, I would think the 7 days with 2 negative tests is a sensible balance.
The argument seems to be getting a bit of steam behind it in the context of what's happening, particularly in the National Health Service, that instead perhaps have been swamped by hospitalisations, and maybe that will happen in time, but right now hospitalisations are not rocketing, that we are in danger perhaps of seeing a self-fulfilling prophecy, that self-isolation, quarantining of staff actually means there are fewer people to look after those people who are sick in hospital right now, not as a function of Omicron necessarily in terms of those being admitted, but the number of people self-isolating.
No, I think you're absolutely right about that the pressure facing the hospitals now is more the staff absence due to the extremely rapid spread of Omicron. My sense is that this is a wave we will go past, and eventually those absences will come down again. You know, it will peak and come down again, and probably we will have to ride out that wave. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't feel good about going to my GP, have a consultation, and later finding out that GP tested positive that morning and gave me Omicron. So I don't think we can go there yet, where we intentionally allow people who are positive to go back to work and spread Omicron. And remember, healthcare workers are surrounded by patients who are more sensitive often to these infections than we are. So we need that level of protection for the time being, I would think.
Professor, we're all kind of becoming, and have become over the last 18 months, amateur statisticians, haven't we? And there is a sense in which we pay particular attention now to hospitalisations rather than cases, because Omicron does seem to be that little bit milder. When it comes to those hospitalisation figures, there is a dispute, I think it's fair to describe it as a dispute, about whether the lion's share of those hospitalisations are people going in because of COVID or people going in with other conditions and incidentally they've got COVID.
Yeah. And, you know, I think that point probably was exaggerated in the previous waves, but I think that point is a very valid one now. It's spreading so quickly. And a lot of people, as you said, with Omicron are in fact not feeling that ill. They are feeling okay, and they may be in hospital for other reasons. That doesn't take away the strain of the hospital, because these patients still need to be isolated, and you need to take a lot of extra care to protect other patients and staff from them, to prevent prevent further spreading of Omicron. But it is something. So I think, yes, we need to stop just looking at the number of patients in hospital with Omicron and look at severity of that and how many are ending up on respirators. And those numbers seem to be, thankfully, stable. So I think initially people were worried. It was frequently said, reasonably so, that a small percentage of a very large number is still a lot of patients. But we haven't seen, so while we have seen the case number of Omicron just spiking like we've never seen before in this pandemic, we haven't seen hospital admissions and patients on respirators spiking at all. In fact, they are relatively stable or increasing very slowly. So I think that's encouraging, and I think there is reasonable cause for optimism that this is not going to be like last January, where shortly after Alpha broke, if you can recall, after that spiked, very shortly after the hospital spiked at the same magnitude and pace.
Professor, we all pray it may be part of that evolutionary process that's taking this virus towards being more like flu than what it has been before. Professor Oakenhag, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Well, as we say there, the hospitality industry, at least in England, welcomed the news that the government would not impose COVID restrictions before the new year. But the 7-day isolation period, it's still having a big impact on the sector, which has seen a swathe of cancellations and no shows over the festive period. Alex Hannay is the assistant manager at the Grapes at Banford in Rochdale. He says his business has done pretty well, actually, over the past few days, but would still welcome a reduced isolation period. Alex, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Do appreciate it. You say you've been relatively busy in recent days. I mean, that's wonderful. Why?
I think everybody was very nervous when we first started in December. There was no guarantee that we weren't going to have restrictions over Christmas. So everybody got the bookings in as quickly as they possibly could, works dues, family dues. So in those first 2 weeks, by comparison to the year before, even on a normal Christmas, we'd have been thrilled with the bookings that we had. And then when there were no restrictions at all, people just chanced it again. They said, well, it looked like something might be coming in the new year. So everybody, again, booked for the family dues, booked for the works dues, and we've been comparatively very lucky, and we're very grateful.
I wonder if there are regional differences, Alex, because the story certainly in London in the run-up to Christmas was a litany of cancelled Christmas parties, bookings being cancelled, no shows, as we say, people booking but just not bothering to turn up, and a howl of protest from the hospitality industry, certainly in the capital. But that's just not your experience.
Quite probably. It makes me wonder if it's to do with with city centre bookings, because the group that we're a part of predominantly. So I'm based in a little village called Bamford, which is just outside of Greater Manchester, on the outskirts of the city. We're fortunate. I think people who have gone for city-based bookings, it feels busier. I think there's a concern that people have in their head that when you go out into the city, or you're using the public transport to get into the city, then you're using it to get back out again, and then you're surrounded by tens of thousands of people. I think there was less of an inclination to want to go for that this year. That might be, thoughts occurring to me now, it could well be that's why, as a smaller pub, a smaller community pub on the outside, people thought we might be a safer bet. And it does make me wonder, as you say, if it's regional basis, that's reflected across Manchester and other boroughs, or if it's to do with down south as well.
Yeah, I mean, yours is a good news story as far as it goes, Alex. I just wonder whether you're facing any problems with your staff levels. Just before Christmas, I took the kids to a pub not a million miles from where you are, and we struggled to get a booking, actually, because there just weren't the people in the kitchen, because they were off. If not with COVID, then they were self-isolating. I was just mentioning to our previous guest, who's more coming at this more from the clinical point of view, making the point that actually sometimes it feels like this is almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you prophesise we're going to be damaged by COVID and people start self-isolating, then there is damage because people simply can't be in the workplace.
That's probably a very fair assessment. Well, particularly with the catering side of things, well, our kitchen's small anyway, so self-isolating, social distancing within that environment became a lot harder. So we just had to cut the number of kitchen staff anyway. So the shifts got smaller, and they had to. We've got one predominant chef who stayed there the whole time, God bless him, and worked through it pretty much, and did the takeaways during lockdown.
Yeah, I hope you're paying well.
Yes,
Alex, you've got to leave it there, but appreciate your time. Alex Hannay, thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Just time for the weather.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge.